Hi, thanks, Sherry. I'm Debra Krol. I'm an enrolled member of the Huckalone or Halone Salinan tribe from the Central California coast. So I'm pretty familiar with the western part of the Southern Sierras. And I'd like to introduce our panelists. First of all is Don Hankins, professor of geography and planning at Cal State Chico. He's also a Miwok cultural practitioner and one of our pyrogeography experts. I love saying pyrogeography. Our next panelist is Crystal Kolden, who is an assistant professor in the management of complex systems at UC Merced, also into pyrogeology. And last but not least, we have Ryan.stewart, who's a forester with Southern Cal Edison. So thanks for taking some time to share what you all know with us. We had some general questions we're going to ask the panelists, and one of the questions that I really saw that I liked was what would you say would be some strategies for effectively creating? Hello, hi there. If you want to give us your ideas for strategies for effectively creating sustainable forests in this time of climate change. So who would like to answer that first? Crystal, are you there? Or Dawn? Hi, Crystal. Sure. There you are.
Yeah, I'm realizing that a lot of you may have connections that are not as stable because you're in smaller towns and more remote areas. But I can take a stab, and I would say I'm the least practitioner of the three of us. So my perspectives come from experience, but also we're looking at this in an academic framework, and also I need to acknowledge in a Western science framework, right? Because that is always one of the key differences that I'm cognizant of, and try to make sure that I frame that this is, I don't have the ground-based experience, nor do I have the indigenous knowledge that, for example, Don does. That he brings to his practice. Big picture, a lot of people have asked us, and particularly me, I've talked to a lot of journalists this year who say, oh, well, you know, how can we bring prescribed fire? Yes, and Deb is one of them. How can we bring prescribed fire back to this forest when climate change is changing everything so quickly, and we had this big drought and we had this massive die-off? And you know, the thing that I always think to myself is, well, it's never too late to start correcting mistakes, right? And yes, conditions have changed, but what we have also seen in the last few years is that makes fire as a tool even more important than ever, right? And there is, I think, a fair amount of sort of fear that, oh, well, we can't use prescribed fire because it will have different types of effects or impacts than we might have, you know, seen 40, 50 years ago, or that we might have, you know, seen under sort of the historical conditions. And I think that there are also good examples in the Sierra right now, in the Southern Sierra, of places where actually good fire is still happening, and that are basically proving that despite climate change and despite this changed system, because we're seeing this rapid transition, right? That we are also still seeing good fire. And you know, I apologize, I wasn't able to make the morning sessions, but you know, I don't know if there was any discussion about what's going on in Yosemite this year. Of course, Yosemite National Park has had multiple fires that they have allowed to burn to meet resource objectives, right? That are still sort of smoldering away, as I understand it. You know, and the largest one, Blue Jay, is, you know, several thousand acres. So we're looking at a place where Yosemite has experienced a lot of those same changes in climate. They've experienced a lot of those same changes in sort of forest structure, although they've been working a lot longer on trying to restore some of the flexibility and the dynamic, facets of that forest structure. And yet, even in this record year, right? And I don't even mean record in terms of what happened in the rest of California this year, but in terms of the weather that we saw, right? August, September, October, hottest 3-month period on record for most of California and much in the Southern Sierra. And yet we've still got Yosemite able to utilize this good fire, right? Even in this type of year. And what that says to me is that if we start to build that sort of framework, right, and utilize prescribed fire, we absolutely can still use it to good ends, and actually will need to use it to good ends under climate change, right? It's been, I think, a pretty big it's been a big frustration for a lot of you to see what has happened, with regards to the giant sequoias and with regards to a lot of places that are sacred spaces in the Southern Sierra, and how they have been so negatively impacted by the fires this year. And to me, that says, okay, this was the example of what happens when we don't get prescribed fire and cultural fire back into these systems, right? And so we need to do more of that. But that's my take.
So I see that I saw Dawn's face on one of the little screens. Dawn, would you like to kind of weigh in from your perspective, from both the Western science and the indigenous cultural practitioner perspective? How can we bring these indigenous tech values into doing these burns and into land stewardship in general, with an eye, of course, to forest management and cultural and prescribed burnings, or is that would be the same thing?
Well, there's definitely a difference in my mind between cultural burning and prescribed burning, but I think that in general, if we think about the effects of climate change and even fire suppression and the impacts of indigenous removal from the landscape, the point is that if we look back over thousands of years, indigenous fire has shaped the landscapes to be fire resilient, to be what the possibility of those landscapes could be, vegetation community-wise, throughout the landscapes. And so when we think about the lack of indigenous fire within the landscape from the time period of, the gold rush in the Sierras, for instance, to the present time period, there's that time period of about 150 years or so where we really haven't had, I guess 170 years now, that process in place. But process is what helps to make the system be what it can be. And so what I see is the opportunity for that ecocultural process to take place again, that by stepping into places where we've had wildfires that have created that footprint for us to come back in and steward again, there's that piece of it. And then there's also the piece of being able to come into places that haven't had fire and utilize the fire in those particular places to allow for that natural sorting out of vegetation community dynamics to allow for those species to be there. To think about that in terms of what discerns indigenous fire from, say, just prescribed burning, a lot of prescribed burning is focused on wildland or wildfire hazard reduction or wildlife habitat improvement. But on the cultural side of it, there's a lot of different reasons for why and how indigenous burning is used. And so some of those purposes might include, very specific outcomes from native grasses. So if we think about blue wild rye, for instance, as a common perennial bunch grass in our region, those grasses are pretty rare nowadays. But if we think about how to steward them to increase them, those are species that that traditionally were part of indigenous diet and still are in some areas, you know, if we can build those up, that's a very specific outcome where, you know, some burns may focus on that, not all burns do. So we need to be thinking about how to steward in that context and all the different reasons, and reading the phenology of the plants and understanding the cues that the animals are providing us for how and when we're going to put fire in the ground. Because I fear that if we're not paying attention to those kind of things, that we may actually be exacerbating the problem when we're putting fire out there. You know, if we're choosing the wrong time to put prescribed burns in, or choosing the wrong times even on the cultural side of it, we may not be getting the desired outcomes we're looking for. So that's a little convoluted response, but I hope that gives a little bit of context to the way that I think about it.
Yes, very much so. Thanks. And so I think we've gone through a few of these already. So I guess I am kind of jumping around a little bit, but one of the things that we all encounter, I mean, not from my standpoint as a journalist, I should say, one of the things that you all as practitioners encounter is resistance from the public, resistance from certain agencies who don't understand the importance of getting fire on the ground and you know, doing these activities both from the cultural standpoint and from the fire reduction standpoint. So can one, two, or all three of you kind of take turns and tell us what have you seen that's worked best to get more community and local fire department engagement and to reduce public resistance to putting fire on the ground? So anyone? Don,
Yeah.
you're right next to me, so I guess maybe you could go first, and then we could get Crystal, and then, you know, since Ryan does a lot with his own forestry, I'd like to get his take too. So Don, go for it.
Sure. So the way that I generally approach getting the buy-in from the agencies and getting, you know, reluctant landowners engaged is really to, I guess, to kind of put the billboard out there. And what I mean by that is I think about the places where people are going to have to see it on a daily basis. You know, by putting a fire as a first entry in a place that is off in a remote area of the forest or somewhere in the landscape where they're not going to see it, they're never going to understand the benefits of it until they can see and interact with it. And so, for instance, at the Big Chico Creek Ecological Reserve near Chico, we have done a lot of burning right at our entryway, where we, you know, have a lot of public interaction coming in. They can see the smoke as they're driving down the highway while we're burning. And if they come in to see the reserve right at the gate, they see areas that have been burned recently against areas that haven't been burned at all. And by doing it that way, that starts to get in people's mind the differences between what proper fire stewardship can look like within a landscape versus a landscape that doesn't have fire in it at all. In terms of getting the agency buy-in, that's something that, in my experience, has taken a little while to get there. You know, we started burning, for instance, on that ecological reserve in 2007, and it wasn't until the last 2 years that CAL FIRE decided to join in and partner with us through the vegetation management program. So we're at the point now that at least locally, they recognize, and they knew that we were burning all along, but they never wanted to put their boots on the ground in the reserve. Now they're at the point that they realize that we have a knowledge set that is missing within their you know, cohort of employees. And so we're able to train them and teach them in a way that I think is really important because we need to build that capacity. But getting back to the idea, if we can put it into places that are visible, then you know, people are going to be more, you know, interested in it. We've done locally in our region, you know, field trips for the public to come out if they weren't able to be part of the fires themselves. You know, a lot of that getting out and discussing the very specific outcomes from those burns are really important processes for people to learn about it. And you're never going to get everybody. There's always going to be the people who think that wildfire is the way that nature intended it to be. But, you know, we have to start somewhere. And I think that, you know, putting it in a visible spot is a good way to go.
Cool. So Crystal, do you have anything to add to that before we go on to Ryan?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's, you know, a lot of the folks that are part of this listening audience are on one side of that line or the other, right? Where they're either trying to burn or they're part of an agency. I see a couple of CARB folks and CAL FIRE folks in the list here, and it's I think it's important to always recognize that agencies are beholden to their chief objective, right? And so if we want to change how agencies interact with prescribed fire, then we have to look at sort of what the processes and the influences are that can make those changes, right? And so I think on the public side, that's where education is huge, and Dawn's example is a great one, right? I think in the course of my career over the last 20 years, we've seen this huge shift in how the public sees good fire, right? And that the public even recognizes now that prescribed fire is a good thing. And 20 years ago, I cannot imagine people in California sort of clamoring for prescribed fire, you know, in their backyards, and that's been a mainstay in the southeastern U.S. for decades. But here, that wasn't something that happened 20 years ago, and now we have that. We've got prescribed burn councils forming. We've got you know, individuals taking it upon themselves to get the training that they need with CAL FIRE to actually go out and do burning on their property and with their neighbors. And that is really due to this impressive amount of education and the folks, you know, like Dawn, that are making it not only part of his mission as an educator, right, but also in terms of sort of showing the public what good fire looks like, right? But for the agencies, agency folks can personally agree with us and say, yes, you know what, we recognize that you need to have more fire, but our agency objective is that we are required by law to do X, Y, and Z. And so a big piece of, you know, what the sort of the work we still have to do is trying to identify where those policies need to shift and where there is, you know, what sort of the pressure points are with politicians and whatnot to change some of those things, right? If air quality laws need to be refined and altered so that we have a better system or modeling approach to assess the trade-offs of prescribed fire smoke versus wildfire smoke that will eventually come later if we don't do prescribed fire, right? You know, CAL FIRE has, they have a pretty clear primary objective. And I think a lot of CAL FIRE folks have seen over the years how good prescribed burning and cultural burning can work on the landscape, but they are still beholden to this primary objective that the state sets for them. And so really putting pressure on the state level government to say, okay, you know what, we would like to see CAL FIRE more involved with prescribed burning. There are certainly CAL FIRE folks across the state that's their primary job, but we want to see more, right? So how do we facilitate that? How do we make sure that those folks don't get pulled off during the middle of fire season and aren't able to plan adequately for when those prescribed burn windows come up, right? And that is at the agency level, that's at the state government level to say, okay, got to put more money aside for this. You've got to, you know, I suggested a couple weeks ago to a state senator's staffer who had called me to ask these types of questions. I suggested to him that we need to have an entire arm of CAL FIRE that they are only about prescribed burning, and that is the thing that they are funded to do, and their objectives are aligned with that, rather than you know, being first and foremost folks that can be pulled onto fires at any moment in time. You know, suggestions I make, but I'm just an academic, so I don't know how these things play out in real life. You know, but that's the type of difference between agencies and the public that we can push forward on in different ways.
Hey, thanks. So Ryan, we haven't heard from you yet. Ryan, or okay. Oh, there he is. Hi, Ryan. Um, so again, you're with the utility. How do you go about getting this buy-in from the landowners and from communities and from agencies to do what you need to do?
Yeah, well, it started a long time ago with us, with John Mount, and I think persistency and consistency. You've got to burn as much as possible, and every year, as and if you're putting smoke in the air, eventually the community has no choice but to accept it. No, I'm just kidding. But that's pretty much it. We burn every year, and it's just kind of become part of the community. We bring them in on fires, show them as much as we can, and they can see the benefits of it when they come out and visit our forest lands. We have interpretive signs and trails that walk people through and show them, the positive benefits of burning. And it's pretty obvious when they walk through Edison lands versus the Forest Service lands that, our lands are a lot more open, there's less fuel, and you can see fire scars on just about every tree in our forest lands. And so it starts there. We also take advantage of any opportunity we can to promote prescribed burning, like for instance, this right here, but also if we get a chance to go down into town and talk to people about things, bring kids up from the high schools in the valley, things like that, show them things, Reedley College, anybody that's willing or interested in coming out and seeing what's going on the forest as far as burning, and also just land management in general. We want to get them out there and show them and promote that. We have a campground, Camp Edison, that people come from all over the state to camp in. And that's a huge opportunity for us to provide. We hire 2 interpretive students every year, and they basically try and get out and promote the message of prescribed fire and also just land management in general again. And then as far as the agencies are concerned, that I think took time for them. When John first started, it was a little easier, I think, for him to burn because there was less scrutiny, I think. He's told some stories, but then there was also, it depended on what agency we're talking about. And then as, I think into the 90s and into the 2000s, things kind of really started tightening up. And it took a while for them to come around to that we burned so often and allowing us to burn as much as we wanted to. And I think that's trust. You need to build trust with the agency that you're working with, whether it be the APCD or whether it's CAL FIRE. And at this point right now, we've got an excellent relationship with both agencies that we need to deal with. CAL FIRE, we have a VMP with them, and they've been excellent. And you guys probably all know we got hit by the creek fire this year. And if it wasn't for, our relationship with CAL FIRE and our VMP played a huge role in saving a lot of acres of forest land from burning at high intensity. So I can't really express how grateful I think just we are to have good relationships with APCD and CAL FIRE right now. And that just, especially after the drought mortality and everything, we're really planning on ramping up how much burning we're going to be able to do. And those relationships are going to be a key role in that. And I've really got a lot of confidence going forward that we're hopefully going to, our whole goal is really to try and get back to a 10, 15 year fire rotation on the property, which is close to the natural rotation. And I think that being involved with CAL FIRE, and I think we can probably do that because they've got the manpower. And also, it's nice to have a friend that's kind of the bully on the block, right? So all that said, though, it all starts really with trust, I think, and just you start small and you build up from there. As far as I would say for land managers interested in starting burning, just get the experience you need to do and build that trust with the local agencies so that over time they realize, this person or this group knows what they're doing. And, especially communication wise, if they're out there, they're seeing that you're being successful. That's how you do it. I really like the suggestion of having CAL FIRE have a unit that burns all year round. Obviously, a year like this year, I could see them pulling that unit in for help, but that's something that's been tossed around for years. And there's always somewhere to burn, it seems like. And I think that we need to have a lot more smoke in the year round in California. So. hopefully that addressed that.
Oh, yeah. So we have a question from which really goes along with what we've all been talking about. And just for the sake of discussion, one of my dad's cattle ranches is in San Benito County, and we used to go out and burn, and you get 200 people together with your boots and your shovels, and you take care of the burn, and then of course you have a big barbecue afterwards. But I always remembered that we had, they didn't call it CAL FIRE back then, they called it Division of Forestry, and we always had one of those green trucks on the property ready to go just in case. So this kind of segues into Tony Ferrante's question, which is, what can individuals within a small foothill community with private landowners from all walks of life, some are cattle ranchers and some aren't, what can they do to introduce and encourage partnership with CAL FIRE to utilize prescribed fires, even if some of the area is a very high fire severity risk zone? And I think I would like to throw a little bit more into that, because no matter where you go, you're going to run into a tribal community. So how can we bring the tribal community into some of these discussions and create partnerships as well? So go for it, folks. Whoever wants to go first. I see Ryan's. Oh, Don's turned his thing off. Hi, Don.
I noticed that Susie Kocher has provided an answer in here for Tony, which is this NRCS EQUIP program.
Mm-hmm.
And it is worth noting, and I have to plug the university and our fantastic extension office to some extent, because when we're talking about a lot of different stakeholders, right, there can be a need to have sort of people coming from different objectives and different perspectives, right? Different frameworks of thinking about this landscape, and different levels of education about what sort of the legalities are and all these sorts of things. And so some of the programs that are out there right now, which have both, a couple of these have been mentioned in the chats. Jared noted the California Forest Improvement Program, which offers grants to do some of this. And then Susie noted the NRCS EQUIP program. Those types of programs, and then UC Extension itself, right, can help a group of individuals find resources and figure out how to start having those conversations to bring groups together, right? So to form something like your local community prescribed burn council, right? And to identify if there are Indigenous stewards in the area who would be, potentially interested in doing some of this burning or helping burn, or, just working on those partnerships, right? So for folks that are interested, they're private landowners, that there's a lot of resources that are offered through the universities and otherwise that can help you start building that coalition of people who are all interested in doing this. And I see that the end of the question as well, that some of this is in a very high fire severity risk zone. My standard answer when people ask about fire severity risk zone is, look, the whole frickin' state's a high fire severity risk zone, right? It's just about timing and conditions. And the challenge, of course, is you can reduce that risk of damaging fire, right, by doing some of this. And I was reminded, I was actually listening to a podcast the other day called Good Fire, that's done by Amy Cardinal Christensen and a colleague of hers up in Canada. And Dawn was the guest that day, so it was perfect timing. And Dawn made a great point in that podcast discussion that I thought would be great for this conversation today, which is, and he just brought it up earlier, this concept of first fire. And how for so many of these recent fires, across the state, but particularly in the Southern Sierra, where there has not been fire in many of these places for over a century, that we have now, in the last 10 years, if you look from the Rim Fire south, we're getting on close to 1 million acres of land that has had fire reintroduced for the first time in potentially a century, right? And that where there might be a lot of hesitation to come in right now, right? Because, oh my gosh, it just burned in this high severity fire, and what are we going to do about this landscape? There's a lot of focus on salvage logging right now. There's a lot of focus on, recovery and et cetera, et cetera. And in my mind, this is the exact point. And this is, I think, what Don's point was about first fire, which is, this is the exact point where we can say, all right, we've got a blank slate. This was the first fire coming in again for the first time in a century. And, we've got a blank slate to work with here. What do we want to do to restore fire to this landscape, right? And don't be afraid of the fact that it just burned, because now that first entry is done. That high fire severity risk, it's gone for a little while, right? And now you actually have a chance to come in and reintroduce fire into this landscape in a much more controlled way, because now all that buildup of a century is gone.
So Don, kind of building on that, recreating the biodiverse landscape that was here before the Europeans showed up. How can we talk to landowners and talk to people who may not have lived here for, even for 20 years, much less 10,000 years, about why it's important to put fire on the ground and how we can bring the biodiversity of that area back?
Well, that's a lot of topic to cover in a few minutes, right?
Oh, I
Yeah.
have faith. You can do it.
Yeah, right. Well, I think about, there's lots of different ways of addressing that. One is to think about what Crystal was just talking about in the first fires. If we're dealing with fire reentry into a place that has had high severity fire or is within a recent fire footprint, I think it's important for us to think about at what scale we want to be burning at. If we burn too frequently across any landscape, we're going to ultimately end up with grass. But if we want to have a forest and we want to have our, mixed chaparral and all of that, then we really need to be thinking about all of those different components of the system. And I tend to focus on the vegetation, obviously, because that's mostly what we're burning. But if we're thinking about the diversity of plants, and then ultimately how that leads to the diversity of animals and fungi and all of that sort of thing, we have to be thinking about the dynamics of how and where fire is being put into that landscape. And so, if we're thinking about a first entry of fire back into a space, in some of these places, and then I think about, some of these areas here in Butte County where I'm at right now, we've got, the whole south end of the county is burned in high severity fires in the last, 2 years. And we're already putting fire back into those areas. But thinking about it, we have to be aware of, what's the importance of that brush community and what that brush community is going to provide ultimately for the oaks to be able to come back in or the conifers to be able to come back in. They play a very important role in the system, but we can then use the fire to steward patches to allow for what I'll think about like a nursery for those forests to be able to develop out of. So that's one way of thinking about it. The other side of it is to think about what we already have in areas that haven't been burnt recently. And, if we think about the vegetation that we're managing or stewarding for, if we've got, grasses and forbs in the understory, is it non-native species? Is it native species? What do we want to try to achieve out of it? And by timing our burns in a way that we can get the desired outcomes. And for me, like I'm sitting here listening to the rain coming down here, and I know that within about 2 to 4 weeks from now, I'm going to have the opportunity to go out and put the herd on a lot of early season non-native annual grasses. And by putting that fire in at that point in time, I'm going to be able to get a lot of different native perennial forbs and grasses to come back in. So, that timing is really important, and we can steward for that diversity in that way. We can also steward for the diversity in thinking about how frequently we let fire back into the landscape. And so, you know, if we burn too frequently, we might limit the total population of, or the total opportunity for diversity of species to be there. But if we space it out across the landscape in time, that's where we're going to get that diversity. So I don't know if that addresses what you're asking, but I think that's what you're asking.
That was it. And going on to Ryan now, we wanted to make, you know, that would be the same question. Is that I know that you're burning primarily to mitigate fires that come through and to protect the forest, but what in your observation have you seen for the ecology of the land as what you've been doing in your work, putting fire down on Southern Cal Ed's lands?
Yeah, so I would say that our burning has been primarily ecological burning since we've been doing it. I would say only recently, just because we had so much slash and stuff from drought mortality, that's when we really started kind of focusing on these areas with a lot of fuel. But even with that, when you're burning, you're going to get all the benefits that are on the, you know, available to you on the pallet, you know. So what I think what we're seeing is, you know, we've got these areas where things burned at high intensity in the creek fire. And so like was spoken about before, we've got this kind of clean slate. And I think we're fortunate enough to have a nursery, and we've kind of went out, you know, while the fire was burning, we were actually out in our green property collecting native seeds, native plants, because they were available time of year. And so we're hopefully, our plan is to go into those high intensity areas and help promote a lot of diversity, and prescribed fire is going to be a huge role in that. So we're going to be planting, obviously. It's a pretty simple formula. So it's going to be, we're going to log it first, and then we're going to plant it, and then we're going to burn it, and then we're going to plant it, and then we're going to burn it, and we're going to plant it, and we're going to burn it. And timing is everything. And it's going to be, it sounds a lot simpler than it's actually be. But basically, as soon as we can run some fire through these areas that burn at high intensity, we're going to try and do that to knock back that brush component and promote some of these, you know, our conifers and things like that. And what we wanted to do is to look more like an uneven age forest from the start. It's going to be hard, obviously, when you first plant, because it's going to be an even age forest. But, you know, over time, using fire and plant through several plantings and things like that, I'm hoping that we can get a lot of structure, gaps, and just diversity on these hillsides that we can kind of promote through using fire, and that as a pretty key tool. And you know, timing is very important. We don't want to just be going out there and burning up all our seedlings that we planted, for sure. And then if you wait too long, you're not going to get anything to carry. So it's going to be interesting how we do it, but I'm looking forward to it. It's going to be a challenge, but that's kind of the plan, is to use prescribed burning as the driver for maintaining diversity on these landscapes that are, like we said, just pretty much denuded at this point.
And I have another question just from the general questions, and that is kind of jumping into how can we manage the invasives and the non-native species that have encroached upon, like, forest lands or grasslands. And you know what we're talking about, like eucalyptus and ornamental grasses that have drifted over from somebody's landscape yard. Here in Arizona, you know, we have this huge problem with buffalo grass and globe chamomile, which is actually causing a lot of desert fires. You know, deserts are not fire adapted, whereas grasslands and forest lands are. But there are still things like eucalyptus and other grasses that burn really hot and really bad during some of our California wildfires. So is anyone thinking about how to deal with those types of species when doing prescribed burning, or just trying to keep them out of the indigenous landscape in general?
I'm pretty sure Don's the expert on this one, because I think I've seen a lot from him doing this.
Okay.
Yeah, we do a lot of burning focused on invasive species, and I think about a lot of the grassland and oak woodland ecosystems where we've been burning for a long while. We started out mostly with yellow star thistle and ripgut brome and a lot of the common invasive grasses in those places. And really the focus was to steward for native grasses, so putting the fire in at the right time to benefit for them and the forbs that we want. And I think one thing I was trying to search for while you were asking the question is, thinking about property lines, because what you do on your land, your neighbor may not be doing on their land, and if you're not on the same management framework, then all of that work is going to be for naught, because all of those weeds are going to continue to come back in. And I've seen this time and time again on multiple burns that I've done, where you burn 100 acres, you could burn 5 acres, 100 acres, whatever it is. But if you're surrounded by weeds, ultimately those weeds are going to come marching back in. So you have to be thinking about what the frequency of fire you want, the timing of those burns. But ultimately, I think the game plan is to get to a point where you can manage at the ecological scale. And I was trying to pull up this picture where we did a burn in February of this last year on the Butte Creek the Big Chico Creek Ecological Reserve, right at our southern boundary where it meets with Bidwell Park. And there you have this nice barbed wire fence and about a 10-acre meadow that's entirely covered in yellow star thistle. And so we've got one side of the fence that's been burnt off, and the south side of the fence is just yellow star thistle standing there ready to burn. And I think, if we could get to the point where we can manage across the boundary and burn that entire meadow system, then we finally would have a chance to start to make some change there. We need to be thinking at that scale. We need to be thinking about how to include our landowners in the adjacent areas and get everybody on the same page. And I think this kind of comes back to that question earlier, how do you get, people engaged? Start with yourself first, start small, build it up to build that capacity within your neighborhood, invite the agencies to come out to be part of it so they can learn, and whatever restrictions they may have around it. But I think, by starting small, you can build up to it, and then you got to be paying attention to those weeds and know what their problems are going to be down the road. Eucalyptus is a whole other game. I haven't had a lot of opportunity to burn, other than in Australia where eucalyptus are native to. I haven't had a lot of opportunity to burn in eucalyptus here in California, but I do think that there's definitely a way of stewarding within them too, just as they are in Australia. But that's a whole other topic on its own.
So Ryan, you undoubtedly have some of these issues too, right? How are you dealing with them?
Well, we're pretty tied in with the county, and they we do a pretty much every year survey on the property. We're looking for invasive species, and if it's not something that we can manage immediately, I'll be honest, we hit it with herbicides, and that's something that we honestly don't use a lot. We don't use a lot of herbicides on the property, but when it comes to invasive species, we feel that it's important to get rid of them. And so the county's involved in that. We're fortunate enough to where we don't have like a lot of like prevalent things like they do up in like Northern California, like star thistle, things like that. We do have it, but it's not something that's we can't get rid of. Hold on. You guys there still? There we go. So we've been able to kind of corral things. We are noticing more Klamath weed moving into the area. And that's something that we've been kind of focusing on. Anytime you see it, you go out, you take care of it. I know that up in Northern California on Blodgett Forest, there's been a lot of focus on that. And I think that what Rob York does is if you find, I want to say it's star thistle. If you find some on the property there, you pluck it and you bring it to him and he'll give you a 6-pack of beer. So incentive programs like that work really well too.
Oh yeah. And clean your farm equipment, guys.
Right. Yeah. And honestly, the Forest Service, I've noticed they've actually in our area, the Sierra National Forest, they're pretty good about making sure when they bring contractors in and things like that, they wash their equipment, and they're taking care of it. When they move equipment, they're washing it. We have a wash station at one of our marinas during the fire, and that's important. And so just monitoring and going out and keeping track of it, and then for us, just making sure that it doesn't get out of hand.
Cool, thanks. So does anybody in the audience have any questions for our panelists besides the one that came in? Anyone?
Deb, while folks are thinking of questions, and if they don't feel comfortable raising their hands or saying them out loud, they can always put them in the chat, of course. You know, the other thing about invasives is that this also very much ties into what we were talking about a little bit earlier with this sort of, you know, first fire, clean slate type of concept. You know, I've been out wandering around the creek fire the last few weeks, various places, and yeah, there are large segments of the creek fire where we have incredibly, you know, high severity fire. The soils have now been really intensely heated, right? And so there's some level of sterilization that's gone on there with whatever seed bank was in that top layer of soil. And, you know, there's also essentially a surface that is just waiting for the first invaders. And so this is another place where, you know, the invasive species don't tend to necessarily be the first thing that people are thinking about for post-fire restoration. And I shouldn't say that way, because bear teams absolutely do think about this, right? That's a big piece of thinking about post-fire rehab is where you can get invasions. But this is another place where we can look and say, okay, in the next few years, as we're thinking about prescribed fire and when the timing is right to start applying it in some of these recently burned areas, you know, part of that thought process and evaluation is absolutely looking at where you've got some invasions going on, because some of these things, you know, once they get in the seed bank, no amount of herbicide is any good at getting them out either, depending on the species. I worked for years trying to deal with cheatgrass in the Great Basin, and man, that stuff has I think an infinity lifespan in the seed bank. So, you know, so fire is not as effective at getting it out, especially once it's starting in the seed bank. But in these first few years after fire in some of these areas, these really high severity areas, this is a chance to utilize prescribed fire to potentially eradicate some of those invasions early before they really get established. And, you know, it's small scale. We're not talking about the whole forest, right? But that's what makes it so complex, is that there's a lot of variability in how the fire burned, and a lot of variability in what some of the impacts are, and where subsequent prescribed fire can be utilized to potentially mitigate some of those negative impacts. And I think that's, you know, that's very much also what Don was describing with this mosaic, and understanding what timing is correct where, and when fire should be applied in a lot of these places.
Cool, thanks.
And I'll plug the UC extension again, because they have an enormous, I've watched several webinars. As a professor, I watch our UC extension webinars all the time, and they've got some great webinars on some of the invasive species burning stuff.
As a reporter, I use them a lot too as a source. So if I don't see any other questions, I think I'm going to invite each of, oh, wait a minute, we see one. It says an invasive grass species where prescribed fire has been seen to be an effective tool is Medusa head. Now that's a new one to me. I haven't heard about Medusa head, but I've lived in the desert for a while. So I guess maybe that would be another question. Or what are some of the other invasive grasses that fire is effective against, to keep it from coming up while you're reseeding and regrowing your indigenous plants?
Yeah, and I'll speak a little bit to Medusa head because it's not one of the ones that you can eradicate with early wet season fires. And so typically burning in the spring, once the grass starts to come into seed, you can burn at that point to have pretty effective control on it. And we've had really good success with that at the Ecological Reserve. And then we're also experimenting with mowing it and then burning the thatch that's developed from that too. So there's different approaches to it. But I always like to use fire as my main tool. So it can be done pretty effectively with fire at the right time. But you also have to be paying attention to what other weeds are potentially out there. Like if you have grass, that's probably going to be one of your later fruiting grasses. And so you have to weigh all these different factors when you're putting fire on the ground in these places.
Great. Well, we are running kind of towards the end here. Oh, wait a minute. We have a question, another question. A question especially for Dawn, also for Crystal and Ryan, about smoke. Is smoke only a health hazard to be managed? Does it have an ecological role? Oh yeah, Dawn, this is right up your alley. What role does smoke play? I know what it plays with salmon, but you might want to tell us some other things.
Right. Well, so I actually had an opportunity to give a talk to the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine in 2019, and here it's mostly health professionals asking about fire impacts and smoke. And in the middle of my talk, I stopped and said, smoke in moderation, like drinking in moderation, is probably good for our health. I'm not a drinker myself, but I do enjoy a little bit of smoke in moderation from our prescribed burns. And certainly, and Crystal alluded to this, the impacts from wildland fire smoke or wildfire smoke can be a lot more impactful. So traditionally speaking, from a cultural perspective, we see fire as something that's beneficial within our environment. We use it in ceremony. We use it to fumigate our trees. If we can get smoke to sit with an inversion in an oak forest, we can reduce the amount of mistletoe. We can minimize the amount of pests within the acorn crop, for instance. These are some of the things that we see the benefits to. And thinking about the salmon, the Deb reference, there's research now validating traditional knowledge from the Klamath River region, but we all know it when we're under that layer of smoke, that the air temperature is cooler. And so when we think about survival of say spring run Chinook salmon, for instance, in our streams, which unfortunately that once dominant run of salmon is no longer dominant, but in Butte Creek Canyon and in the Klamath River, where we still have decent runs of those fish, if in the summertime you have that smoke layer and the inversion sets in, you can cool the water temperature down for those fish to be able to survive. And so there's lots of different reasons and benefits for the smoke within our environment. I could keep going on and on, but that's a good intro to it.
So Crystal, what do you want to add to that?
I mean, I am not, my knowledge of specifics is pretty low, particularly compared to Dawn's deep knowledge in this area. But what I always tell my students when we talk about sort of fire's ecological role, its natural ecological role on these landscapes, is that these species all evolved with fire, and if we accept that these landscapes and these species evolved with fire, whether it was indigenous fire or lightning 90 fire, or a combination of both, depending on where we're at, right? That means that they also evolved with smoke, right? And so that that would suggest to me that Western science we don't know everything, right? Obviously, we don't even know close to anything most of the time. What's the phrase that I've always loved is the more you know, the more how little you actually know, right? And I find that is absolutely true as I get further in my understanding of the world. And smoke is one of those things that we haven't undertaken tons of studies to figure out, what's the beneficial effect of smoke on X, Y, and Z, in part because we have a legacy of assuming that smoke is bad, right? But there must be some benefit for a fair portion of plants and animals on that landscape and for the system as a whole, because it evolved with it over millennia.
So Ryan, somebody popped up with a question that you might be able to answer. In addition, have you seen the prescribed burning have an effect on sods or bark beetles and particularly ticks? I've heard back east that some of the tribes that burn back there are helping control their ticks with that. Is that something that you've observed as you've been burning?
We don't really have sods up in our area, fortunately.
Good.
As far as bark beetles, I think that when you're just using fire, you're going to reduce that brush component, and you're going to be thinning the forest. And when you do that, you're going to be minimizing impacts from ticks and beetles and things like that. There's less habitat for them, right? As far as bark beetles are concerned, we had a more open and diverse forest because of burning, and when the drought mortality hit our area, we saw the benefits of that because there was just less of a homogeneous stand for them to settle into and destroy. So just having that mixed forest, mixed species, and everything that kind of as a benefit from fire is something that breaks things up. The more diversity you have, obviously, the better prepared you are for resilience against things, like bark beetles, fire, etc.
Cool. And we have time for one last question. I think this is possibly one of the most important questions of the whole panel. How much time do we have to start restoring the areas that have burned? Probably not only the first file areas, but some of the ones that burned pretty heavily this last season. And do you think the Forest Service will be able to act in a timely manner? Now that's a biggie. So we want to go in reverse order. We'll go Ryan, Crystal, and then Dawn. What do you think, Ryan?
Hey, I'm really sorry I got interrupted. Can you ask
Sure.
that question again? I'm sorry.
This is the last question from a panel. From an audience. How much time do we have to start the restoration of the burned areas? And do you think the Forest Service will be able to act in a timely manner?
That's a great question. So the time to start is now. The way I look at it is as soon as the fire was burning in our area, we realized the importance of getting in and trying to salvage log, not just to kind of recover some of the value of our timber, but also to get a lot of that fuel out of the forest and kind of prepare those seed beds. We saw a lot of fire seed, seed spread after the fire. There's seed everywhere, all over the forest floor. So if we could get in and salvage log this fall before winter hits and spring comes, then we're not, that'll give that seed a chance to regenerate, and we're not driving over it with tractors and skidders, right? And so that's kind of as far as salvage logging, the quicker the better, in my opinion. Also, the ground was dry, so you're not going to have compaction and things like that like you would. There's always going to be, there's some discussion as far as salvage logging and erosion control, but from what I've seen, the whole landscape was pretty denuded, and getting that fuel out, we're really preparing the land now for us to be able to get it planted and get it started. I've seen, and so far where we have logged it, it's looking really good, and I'm really happy with the results. So yeah, as soon as possible, I guess, is the answer to the first question. Is we've got to get on it as quick as you can. The Forest Service, I know a lot of good people that work for the Forest Service, but they're just, they're trying to fight a fight with, all their limbs tied behind their back. And so it's just, it's going to take time for them to get on it. And when they do get on it, they're not going to be able to they're going to have to be very strategic about where they go, because, they're not going to be able to do large landscape and watershed treatments, which is what they need to do. But, they've got, a lot of land, and that in the creek fire, they've got 370,000 acres that's burned. And I haven't seen, but quite a big chunk of that is high intensity. So they've got a pretty pretty big monster staring them down, and they're just not really honestly equipped to deal with it. They're not going to be able to come at it and do anything about it necessarily. That's going to be, I mean, I hate to be kind of a kind of poo-poo it, but I mean, I think we're looking at, past record isn't so good with them, right? So I mean, it would just, I mean, they're gonna have a lot of trouble being effective at getting those lands back into shape and restoring them. I think that they're gonna have to end up leaning on prescribed fire a lot, and I think that is one tool that they do have that they could probably utilize. I just don't know if they'll be able to do it at the scale that they need to.
Crystal, what's your take on all of this?
My hot take, since we're running over time here, is I would ask the question differently or frame the question differently, right? How much time do we have to start restoration? Remember that this is a landscape that will ultimately restore itself. It's not waiting. It doesn't depend on us. Eventually things will regrow. And the question is, where are there critical areas that we want to have facilitated restoration or support? And I think about the giant sequoias as being one of the places where, of course, the ones that are consumed are lost, but there are a lot of giant sequoias left that have enormous cultural and emotional attachment for people, and so where do we want to do really focused work to support those type of areas where they're sacred sites that need to have facilitated restoration, right? Because a lot of the forest, it will do what it's going to do, right? It's been doing it for millennia, and I think that for the other half of the question, will U.S. Forest Service be able to act in a timely manner? For folks that want to see something happen up there, the best way to answer that question is to go join an NGO or a local community group that wants to take action, right? Because everybody's got different objectives. Obviously, Ryan's with SCE. They've got very clear objectives about what their role is in forest management to facilitate sort of landscape health and facilitate water and power, and that all the sort of network of objectives that are associated with that. But other folks have different objectives, and so expecting the Forest Service, to take on everything is, I think, unrealistic. And it's more about, for individuals, thinking, okay, what is the thing that I care most about? Do you really care about the giant sequoias? Go work with Save the Redwoods, or if you are really concerned about, Dinky Creek or someplace like that, which luckily didn't really have a lot of those big negative impacts, but is still susceptible to future fire, right? Join the local collaborative that works on that, right? If you're interested in certain areas, get involved instead of just waiting impatiently for the Forest Service to make magic happen, because that agency is far too overstretched. They don't have the budget, and there are far too many stakeholders with very different objectives that they have to answer to. So it's part of why they struggle to meet a lot of these required, these requests. But
Dawn, you have the last word.
All right, I'll try to make it short. So I think in terms of the restoration of these areas that have burned, I see a narrow window of opportunity to actually be able to make the change if we're thinking about correcting with fire. So, typically I'm looking at what are we doing within the first 5 years following a fire? And if we get to a 10-year time period without fire, are we setting ourselves up to see an even worse fire happen? And a good case in point about that is to think about the 2008 lightning complex here in Butte County that burned through the Concal Basin. That set up the situation for the campfire to be what it was. Fuels on the ground, fast-moving grass fire through those heavy fuels, lopping embers into the town of Paradise. I think if we're aware of that, and if we can think about how to steward within those landscapes to reduce fuel, to manage for the diversity, that's where we're going to see the greatest change. And I think the other things we need to be thinking about in terms of post-fire landscapes is, do we need to come in and remove all those trees? What do we do with the slash? you know, one of the things that I've been conceptualizing locally is how can we take some of that slash to, you know, create biochar, put that back into the landscape? Can we create that biochar by burning under the right conditions so that we can help to retain soil moisture, for instance, that will help the forest to recover and be more resilient down the road? You know, there's lots of different factors at play. You know, if we take out all the stumps, does that create a situation where the wind patterns change and create more drying? Lots of different things to be thinking about. In terms of the Forest Service, I'll take it in a little bit different direction, and I'll say, you know, what if the Forest Service recognized their trust responsibility to tribes, and what if tribes had the opportunities to come in and do that stewardship? Because it's doubtful that the agencies themselves will be able to do it, but I do think that there's interest and capability that's growing amongst tribes to be able to do that work within their ancestral territories. And I think that would be a really powerful thing to see happen. And, you know, it's not tribes working on their own, but it's everybody working together to support that. So I'll leave it with that. Thank you.
Well, thanks, folks. This has been a really good panel, and I think that I wish we had another couple of hours, but I think Ryan's got a really good presentation coming up. And thank you all. It's been enjoyable, and I'm going to put my my email up here if anybody has some tips or wants me to come cover something related to what you're doing. Please shoot me an email. I cover Arizona, California, Nevada, and New Mexico. So that's a big territory, but I'm always willing to come home and cover something for you guys. So thank you all very much. And I hope to see you again in person someday. Okay, thanks.